This is Land of Havilah, Esther chapter 2. The king has put away the queen, now verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was pacified, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then the king's servants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king." Comment in verse 1, the king forgot about his anger and remembered Vashti. In other words, he wasn't angry with her anymore and couldn't get her off his mind even after a long time. His attendants knew that according to the law of Medes and Persians, he couldn't take her back because his decree against her was unalterable, Esther 1:19. So in verse 2 they said, "Let beautiful virgins be sought." They go on telling him, verse 3, "Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel of Susa, to the women's house, to the custody of Hegai the king's eunuch, keeper of the women. Let cosmetics be given them, and let the maiden who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." The thing pleased the king, and he did so. Comment in verse 3, Hegai was a eunuch, a keeper of the women. He was in charge of the harem, in other words. It turns out coming up that there were two harems, one for virgins which Hegai kept, and one for concubines which someone else kept. After a virgin visited the king, she was transferred to the second harem. Verse 5. There was a certain Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Comment in verse 6, who got taken captive, Mordecai or his great-grandfather Kish? King Jeconiah was taken captive approximately 597. It's now 114 years after that, or a little more. Therefore, the only way to interpret the sentence is that Mordecai's great-grandfather Kish was the one taken captive. Speaking of Mordecai, verse 7, he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was fair and beautiful, and when her father and mother were dead, Mordecai took her for his own daughter. Comment in verse 7, Esther's parents passed away. She must have been small at the time because her first cousin Mordecai adopted her and brought her up. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. Verse 8. So when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together to the citadel of Susa, to the custody of Hegai, Esther was taken into the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. Comment, after a kingdom-wide beauty search of all 127 provinces, as verse 3 described it, Esther was taken into the king's harem of virgins along with many others. There's no indication of how voluntary or involuntary it was. It was just a fact. Speaking of Hegai, the eunuch keeper of the virgin house, verse 9, the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness from him. He quickly gave her cosmetics and her portions of food, and the 7 choice maidens who were to be given her out of the king's house. He moved her and her maidens to the best place in the women's house. Comment, Hegai assigned 7 maidens to Esther for attendance and gave her the best accommodations in the house. There was probably something pleasing about her over and above her looks. Verse 10. Esther had not made known her people nor her relatives because Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make it known. Comment, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego kept with their heritage. They refused to eat the king's food because it didn't comply with the law of Moses, Daniel 1:8. Esther kept her heritage a secret. She ate like a pagan, but Yahweh didn't hold it against her. She was following Mordecai's instructions. Verse 11. Mordecai walked every day in front of the court of the women's house to find out how Esther was doing and what would become of her. Comment, Mordecai remains concerned about Esther, and now the king will begin the selection process. Verse 12. Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after her purification for 12 months, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet fragrances and with preparations for beautifying women. Comment, it took a minimum of 12 months before a virgin was ready to visit the king. Once they were ready, here's how the process worked. Verse 13. The young woman then came to the king like this. Whatever she desired was given her to go with her out of the woman's house to the king's house. Comment, she could wear whatever she wanted from the wardrobe of the entire house and pack whatever else she wanted because she wouldn't be coming back. Still speaking of any virgin whose turn it was to be with the king, verse 14. In the evening she went, and on the next day she returned into the second women's house to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She came in to the king no more unless the king delighted in her, and she was called by name. Comment: the king's privileges and wealth are mind-blowing that he never had the same girl twice unless he called one back by name. Any woman who had been with him was transferred to the concubine's house, presumably for the rest of her life. Verse 15. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, came to go in to the king, she required nothing but what Hegai the king's eunuch, the keeper of the women, advised. Esther obtained favor in the sight of all those who looked at her. Comment: Esther wasn't bridezilla. Whatever Hegai recommended, that's what she took. When she went into the king, nothing else. On the scale of being agreeable versus disagreeable, she tilted far to the agreeable side. Verse 16. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Comment: the drunken party was 4 years ago. Verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she obtained favor and kindness in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Comment: for better or worse, she won the contest. Verse 18. Then the king made a great feast for all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. Comment: he threw a feast to introduce the new queen to the kingdom. Verse 19. When the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Comment: the virgins were gathered together the second time. In other words, they've all passed from virgin status to concubine status, so they're all living in the same accommodations again. Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, which doesn't mean that he was actually sitting in a gate, but that that was a figure of speech to indicate that he was a royal official. In other words, in the gate means the same thing as in the king's court. But as we'll find out, he didn't rank high enough to have much access to the king. Verse 20. Esther had not yet made known her relatives nor her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai like she did when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who were doorkeepers, were angry and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. Comment: 2 of the eunuchs are planning to assassinate the king. Verse 22. This thing became known to Mordecai, who informed Esther the queen, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Comment: she said, King, I have a news flash. A certain of your officials named Mordecai says that 2 of your eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, are planning to assassinate you. She didn't tell the king that she was related to Mordecai because she was hiding the fact that she was a Jew, according to Mordecai's instructions. Verse 23. When this matter was investigated and was found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Comment: the incident was recorded in the royal records. As we'll find out, the information in the records included the fact that it was Mordecai who reported it, and now the king has another reason to be glad he chose Esther. Esther 3 is next.